happened one golden afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia, where the city heat shimmered like glass and the hum of construction echoed between skyscrapers. A man stepped out of a silver pickup truck, wearing a faded construction uniform, his boots powdered with dust, his eyes calm but distant. His name was Raymond Walker, a man who had built towers for others, but carried the ruins of his own past inside. As he walked through the busy streets, people glanced at him without recognition, some with judgment, others with pity. To them, he was just another worker finishing a shift. But behind that uniform stood the CEO of Walker Industries, one of the most powerful construction firms in the South. Yet that day, he wasn't headed to a meeting or a groundbreaking ceremony. He was headed home, or at least to what used to be home. 13 years ago, he'd walked away from his family after losing everything in a failed project. Pride had kept him from returning. Success had kept him away longer. And now, after years of silence, guilt brought him back. Inside his glass-walled office that morning, his assistant Lisa Porter, a sharp young woman with kind eyes, had stood at his door. "Sir, are you sure about this?" she asked. "Meeting your sister like that? In those clothes?" Raymond adjusted his worn gloves and replied quietly, "To see someone's heart, you must hide what makes them respect you." Lisa frowned. She might not understand. Raymond gave a small smile. If love needs understand, it's not love. It's negotiation. He took a breath, grabbed his old toolbox, and walked out, leaving behind a polished office for a day that would test everything he'd learned about people. Across town, in a small but cozy apartment, Grace Walker, his younger sister, was running from room to room, fluffing pillows, straightening curtains, polishing glass that already gleamed. Her boyfriend, Andrew Collins, sat on the couch in a sharp navy suit, scrolling through his phone with a smug grin. "Babe," he said, not looking up, "today's the day. The CEO of Walker Industries is coming to meet me personally. This contract will change everything." Grace smiled warmly. "That's wonderful, Andrew. I'm proud of you." Andrew finally looked up, his grin widening. "You should be. Once I sign this deal, we'll have enough to move into that Buckhead townhouse I told you about." Grace brushed a bit of lint from his jacket. "Just promise me one thing," she said softly. "No matter who you meet, treat them with kindness." Andrew laughed. "Sweetheart, please. I know how to handle people like that. You don't get big opportunities by being humble. You get them by being seen." Grace's smile faded slightly, but she didn't argue. She'd learned that Andrew's confidence often came with cruelty. As noon approached, Andrew paced the living room, checking his Rolex every few minutes. "Where is this guy? It's already 1 o'clock." Grace tried to calm him. "Maybe he's running late." "CEOs don't run late," he snapped. "They make other people wait." Then came the knock. 3 sharp knocks that sounded heavier than they should have. Grace opened the door and froze. Standing, there was a man with streaks of gray in his hair, his face lined but familiar. He wore dusty boots and a faded shirt, and yet something in his eyes was steady and strong. "Raymond," she whispered. The man smiled faintly. "Hey, sis. You look good." Her voice broke. "You're alive. 13 years, Raymond. 13 years. I thought you were gone." She threw her arms around him, tears spilling down her cheeks. Andrew stood behind her, his brows furrowed. "Who's this guy?" he demanded. Grace turned, still holding her brother's hand. "Andrew, this is my brother." "Your brother?" he repeated with disbelief. Then he laughed sharply. "You mean this guy? In a construction uniform?" "Grace, we're expecting someone important today. Not whatever this is." Grace's smile faded. "Don't talk about him like that." Andrew rolled his eyes. "Come on, look at him. He's probably some guy who fixes roofs. We're meeting the CEO of a billion-dollar company. I can't have this guy here when he arrives." Raymond looked at him quietly, no anger in his voice. "It's fine," he said softly. "I didn't come to intrude." But Grace stood firm. "No, you're my brother. You belong here." Andrew's tone turned cold. "You've got 2 choices, Grace. Either he leaves or you both do." The silence that followed was heavy. Grace's eyes filled with tears again, but this time not from joy. She turned to Raymond, her voice trembling. "What do I do?" He gave her a small, sad smile. "It's all right, sis. Let him have his house. We'll talk another day." He turned to leave, but Grace's hand shot out and grabbed his sleeve. "No," she said, her voice breaking. "I've lived too long beside people who only see worth in money. I'm leaving with you." Andrew's jaw dropped. "Grace, don't do this. Think about your future. When I sign this deal, I'll have everything. Money, power, respect. You'll regret walking out that door." Grace took a deep breath. "Maybe, but at least I'll be walking towards someone who remembers who I am." She walked out beside her brother, closing the door softly behind her. Andrew shouted after them, "You'll come crawling back when you see me on TV." But the door never opened again. Later that afternoon, Andrew strutted to the marble lobby of Walker Industries headquarters, his designer shoes tapping floor in rhythm with his arrogance. "I'm here to see Mr. Raymond Walker," he told the receptionist. She smiled politely. "Yes, Mr. Collins. The CEO will be right with you." He nodded confidently. "Good. He'll know real talent when he sees it." Minutes passed. Then, the elevator doors opened. Everyone in the lobby turned as the CEO stepped out. Andrew straightened his jacket until he saw who it was. Raymond Walker walked calmly toward him, still wearing that same dusty uniform, a quiet storm in his eyes. Every employee rose to greet him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Walker," they said in unison. Andrew's mouth fell open. "You," he gasped. "You're the CEO?" Raymond looked at him steadily. "When you saw me as a worker, you saw dirt. Now that you see power, you see gold." Andrew's voice cracked. "Sir, it was all a misunderstanding. Please, I didn't know." "No," Raymond interrupted. "You didn't care to know." He walked to the table, picked up the signed contract Andrew had prepared, and tore it clean in half. Walker Industries doesn't build with men who can't see beyond appearances. Andrew fell to his knees. "Mr. Walker, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. Grace and I, we love each other." Raymond's tone softened slightly, but his gaze stayed cold. "Love that depends on power isn't love. It's business with prettier words." He dropped the torn papers in front of him and walked out without another glance. That evening, Raymond found himself sitting on a park bench in East Point, under the same oak tree where he and Grace used to play as kids. Grace sat beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Why'd you leave all those years ago?" she asked quietly. He sighed. "I failed, Grace. I lost everything, and I didn't want you to see me broken. I thought I had to rebuild before I could come home." She smiled softly through tears. "You didn't have to come back, Rich, Raymond. You just had to come back." He looked at her, eyes filled with regret and relief. "Maybe that's what I forgot," he said. "That the people who see you when you're nothing, those are the ones who really matter." As the camera of life panned out, the city lights flickered in the distance, and the sound of traffic faded into the hum of cicadas. Grace whispered, "Do you think people like Andrew ever change?" Raymond smiled faintly. "Only if they learn to look deeper." He removed his dusty cap, set it on his lap, and looked toward the skyline glowing gold against the darkening sky. "Maybe humanity still exists," he said, "but you have to look past the surface to find it." The next morning the sky over Atlanta was gray and heavy with rain the way it often is when something new is about to begin. Raymond sat by the window of his apartment, a cup of black coffee in his hands, watching the city move below him. The night before had been filled with silence and memories, and now the weight of those years apart from his sister pressed harder than ever. Grace was asleep in the guest room, exhausted from tears, and for the first time in years the quiet didn't feel lonely. It felt like family. He stared at the raindrops crawling down the glass and thought back to the day he'd left, 13 years earlier, when everything he had built had fallen apart in a single week. He remembered the sound of the phone ringing in the old Walker construction office, the shouts of investors, the accusations of fraud that weren't true but were loud enough to destroy him anyway. His young wife had packed her things and left that same night, taking their little boy with her. The next morning he'd walked out of Atlanta with nothing but a duffel bag and a promise that he'd come back when he was somebody again. He kept that promise, but not without paying for it with blood, sweat, and years he could never get back. Now, sitting in the same city he once fled, Raymond whispered to himself, "I made it back, Dad. I made it back." His father had been a builder too, a simple man who believed in honest work and clean hands. He had raised Raymond and Grace in a small neighborhood in East Point, teaching them that every brick you lay should hold your integrity. Raymond had forgotten that once, chasing prestige instead of purpose. Grace, on the other hand, had stayed true to those roots even when life wasn't kind. Later that day, Grace woke up and found her brother still at the window. "You haven't changed," she said softly. He smiled without turning. "I wish that were true." She sat beside him. "Do you remember when you used to build model houses in the backyard? You said one day you'd build real ones for real people." Raymond nodded. "I built them, all right. Just forgot about the people." Grace looked down. "Andrew wasn't always like that. You know, he used to be kind. Before the money, before the greed." Raymond sighed. "People don't change because of money. Money just unmasks who they really are." Grace nodded sadly. Across town, Andrew Collins sat alone in his apartment, staring at his phone. The torn contract lay crumpled on the table beside an untouched glass of whiskey. His voicemail was full, all from investors backing out after word spread about his outbursts at Walker Industries. He had built his reputation on charm, but now every call went unanswered. He slammed his fist on the table. "That man ruined me," he hissed. But deep down he knew it wasn't Raymond who'd done it. It was his own pride. He looked around the empty apartment that once felt luxurious but now seemed hollow. The furniture, the art, the designer suits, all meant nothing without the respect he'd lost. For the first time, he saw himself clearly, not as a confident businessman he pretended to be, but as a man who had mistaken arrogance for ambition. Still, the bitterness was too strong for reflection. He poured another drink and muttered, "I'll fix this. I'll get it all back." Meanwhile, Raymond took Grace to visit their old neighborhood. The streets were cracked, the houses smaller, but the memories were still alive. They walked past the church where their parents used to sing, the playground where they built sand castles that collapsed with every wind gust, and finally stopped at their childhood home. A small wooden house with peeling paint, but a warm glow in its windows. The new owners, an elderly couple, recognized Raymond's name and invited them inside. He stood in the living room staring at the same wall where his father once hung his work gloves. "He used to come home every evening," Raymond said quietly, "and tell us, what you build with your hands doesn't last, but what you build with your heart does." I never understood what he meant until I lost everything. Grace squeezed his hand. "Then maybe it's time to build something that lasts this time." That night, they had dinner together. Grace cooking like their mother used to, Raymond laughing for the first time in years. They talk about the past, about mistakes, forgiveness, and how the world forgets the quiet strength of simple people. It was late when Grace finally said, "Ray, you should tell your story someday. People think success is just money, but you've lived the truth." Raymond smiled. "Maybe I'll tell it when it's finished." The next few weeks passed quietly. Raymond spent time visiting job sites under the skies again. Not as a CEO, but as a worker among his crew. He helped them lay bricks, listened to their stories, and remembered what real work felt like. He saw how men struggled to make ends meet, how some sent money home to families they barely saw. It grounded him again. He realized that the real empire he wanted wasn't one made of steel and glass, but of respect and compassion. During those same weeks, Andrew's world kept collapsing. Creditors called. One of his business partners sued him for breach of contract. His car was repossessed. The townhouse lease was terminated. In desperation, he tried calling Grace, but she didn't answer. He even went to Walker Industries headquarters, but security turned him away. Humiliated and broke, he wandered the streets of Atlanta for hours until he found himself outside a construction site, the very site Raymond had been visiting undercover. Andrew stood there watching the workers, and for the first time, something inside him softened. He saw men covered in dust, sweating under the sun, laughing despite their exhaustion. It hit him. These were the people he used to look down on. Days later, he saw Raymond there, dressed in his work clothes, helping lift beams, wiping sweat with the same calm grace he always had. Andrew hesitated, then approached slowly. "Mr. Walker," he called out. Raymond turned, surprised but not angry. "Andrew?" Andrew swallowed hard. "I came to say, I'm sorry." The words trembled out. Raymond said nothing, just nodded. "I lost everything," Andrew continued. "And I realized maybe I never really had anything to begin with." Raymond looked at him for a long moment, then said, "Sometimes you have to lose what blinds you before you can see what matters." Andrew's eyes watered. "Is there any way I can start over?" Raymond thought for a while. "Come here tomorrow morning at 6. Bring work boots." Andrew looked confused. "For what?" Raymond smiled faintly. "You'll see." The next morning, as dawn painted the sky pink and gold, Andrew showed up in old jeans and borrowed boots. Raymond handed him a hard hat. "Welcome to work." Andrew blinked. "You mean?" "You wanted a fresh start," Raymond said. "Start from where you should have never looked down." And so Andrew joined the crew, carrying cement, pushing wheelbarrows, and learning humility the hard way. The first days were rough. His hands blistered, his back ached, and more than once he thought about quitting. But each time he looked up and saw Raymond working beside him, silent and steady, he pushed on. Grace would come by sometimes with lunch, watching the two men rebuild not just a structure but themselves. She saw the shift in Andrew, his pride cracking, his voice softer, his eyes no longer full of arrogance but something new, gratitude. Raymond noticed it too, but he didn't say anything. He let the work teach what words couldn't. Weeks passed, and slowly Andrew began to change. He stopped chasing deals and started helping others. He'd share his lunch with the day laborers, stay late to clean up, and one day, when a young worker hurt his hand, he was the first to drive him to clinic. The men began to respect him, not because of who he was, but because of what he did. And Raymond, watching from a distance, felt something he hadn't felt toward Andrew before: hope. By the end of that month, the project was complete. The crew gathered to celebrate, laughing and sharing stories. Raymond stood in the middle of them, not as their boss, but as one of them. Grace was there too, smiling at her brother and at the man who had finally learned to see. Raymond raised a glass of sweet tea and said, "To second chances, and to the people who teach us what pride can't." As the camera of memory pulled back on that warm Georgia evening, the sun dipped low with a half-finished skyline, and the voices of workers echoed through the fading light. Somewhere in that chorus was a sound of redemption, slow, patient, and hard-earned. The summer heat in Atlanta gave way to a gentler September breeze that carried the smell of rain and fresh asphalt. On the construction site where Walker Industries had just finished its community housing project, the last crane was rolling away, and the workers were cleaning their tools. Raymond stood quietly at the edge of the lot, watching Andrew laugh with the crew. The man who once barked orders at waiters now wiped sweat from his brow and handed out bottled water to the team. Raymond smiled faintly. Transformation, he thought, isn't loud, it's steady. That evening, the company hosted a small dinner for the workers and their families in a rented hall downtown. String lights hung across the ceiling, and barbecue smoke filled the air. Grace moved through the crowd with a bright ease that Raymond hadn't seen in her since childhood. When Andrew approached her, holding 2 plates of food, there was hesitation in his voice. "I know I can't erase what I said," he murmured, "but I can try to be someone better." Grace studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Keep doing the work, Andrew. Let your actions apologize." He looked down and whispered, "Yes, ma'am." Later that night, after the music faded, Raymond drove out to a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. A modest house sat at the end of the cul-de-sac, its porch light still on. He parked and sat there for nearly 10 minutes before he finally stepped out. The woman who opened the door froze for half a breath. "Ray," she whispered. It was Elena, his ex-wife. Her hair had streaks of silver now, and her expression held both strength and caution. "You look well," she said softly. Raymond nodded. "So do you?" He hesitated, then asked, "Is Ethan here?" She nodded toward the backyard. "He's 17 now, taller than you." Raymond walked around the house to the backyard and saw a teenage boy practicing basketball under the porch light. The sound of the ball thudding against concrete was steady, focused. "You got a good shot," Raymond said gently. The boy turned, cautious. "Thanks," he replied. "Do I know you?" Raymond took a breath. "Not yet. I'm your father." The ball rolled away, and silence hung between them. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You disappeared." Raymond's throat tightened. "I did. I was lost, ashamed. I thought staying away would spare you the sight of my failure." Ethan looked at him, hurt flickering behind guarded eyes. "You don't get to decide that." Raymond nodded. "You're right." They stood there under the hum of the porch light until finally Ethan muttered, "Mom said you built half the city. Guess you finally built something that lasted." Raymond smiled sadly. "Only if you'll let me rebuild here too." Over the next weeks, Raymond kept visiting. He didn't talk about business. He helped Ethan with homework, showed him how to fix a car engine, and sat quietly through his basketball games. Each small moment mended something invisible. Elena watched from a distance, cautious but slowly warming. One evening she told him, he doesn't need a rich father, he just needs a present one. Raymond nodded. "That's the man I'm trying to be." Meanwhile, Grace had begun volunteering at a community center downtown, using money Raymond donated to create training programs for unemployed workers. Andrew joined her, teaching basic construction skills and helping people write resumes. The locals noticed how humble he'd become. The same man who once mocked dirty hands now shook every worker's hand at the end of each class. Redemption had found him, but it was quiet and unadvertised. Months passed. Walker Industries launched a new project, a development of affordable housing named the Walker Hearts Initiative. Raymond insisted that half the leadership positions be filled by people who had once been day laborers. During a press conference, a reporter asked why a billionaire cared about low-income housing. Raymond smiled into the microphones. "Because I used to think success was measured in glass towers. Then I realized it's measured in the roofs that keep families dry." That night, the local news played the clip on every channel. Ethan watched it from the couch, silent, then turned to his mother. "He's really different." She nodded. "Sometimes pain makes people gentler." Ethan picked up his phone and texted one word, "proud." Raymond saw it hours later and stared at the screen until his eyes blurred. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to cry. The story of Walker Industries began to spread beyond Atlanta. Business schools invited Raymond to speak. Journalists wanted profiles. But Raymond always deflected the attention toward his employees and toward Grace's community work. "They remind me who I am," he'd say. Privately, though, he still battled guilt for the years he'd missed with his son and sister. One evening, as he sat on the rooftop of his building looking out over the glowing skyline, Grace joined him with 2 cups of tea. "You're still punishing yourself," she said gently. "Forgiveness isn't forgetting, Ray. It's letting yourself move." He smiled. "I'm learning." Meanwhile, Andrew faced his own test. A former investor reached out with a tempting offer. Fast money, shady real estate deals, a shortcut back to wealth. For a moment, the old greed whispered in his ear, but he looked at his calloused hands, remembered Raymond's words, "Start where you should have never looked down," and turned the offer down. Instead, he proposed something else: to build small, honest homes with the same workers who taught him humility. When he told Raymond about it, Raymond clapped a hand on his shoulder. "That's how you know you've changed. When the easy wrong loses its shine." By winter, Atlanta's skyline glowed with new projects, and the Walker Hearts Initiative neared completion. Raymond, Grace, Andrew, and Ethan stood together during the ribbon-cutting ceremony as families moved into their new homes. The air was cold, but joy was warm. A reporter asked Raymond what message he hoped people would take from his journey. He paused, looked at his sister, his son, and the man he once despised, and said that sometimes the people we judge are the mirrors of who we could become, and that humanity still exists, but you have to be willing to look deeper to see it. The crowd applauded. But for Raymond, the all applause was the quiet sound of Grace laughing with Ethan, and Andrew shaking hands with the workers he now called brothers. As the sun set over the city, Raymond thought his father again and whispered, "The heart builds what the hands cannot." Winter slid into a soft Atlanta spring, the air smelling of clay and wet pine. Raymond had begun taking Ethan to the job sites every weekend. The boy wore a bright orange vest 2 sizes too big and carried a small notebook, sketching floor plans while his father walked the grounds. Raymond never pushed. He just talked about materials, patience, the rhythm of teamwork. One morning he stopped beside a half-framed wall and said quietly, "The strongest beams aren't always the prettiest." Same with people. Ethan grinned and wrote it down. As the Walker Hearts initiative grew, so did the company. New partners wanted in, eager to use the charitable billionaire image for their brands. Raymond could feel the pull of old temptations. The slick smiles, the fast deals, the promises whispered at charity dinners. His board urged expansion, even overseas. Lisa Porter, now promoted to executive director, warned him one evening, "Sir, the investors want bigger profits. They say the community projects are bleeding money." Raymond looked out over the lights of the city and said, "Maybe the world bleeds because no one's willing to lose a little." A few weeks later, the storm arrived. A high-ranking executive named Derek Stone, a man Raymond once mentored, secretly signed contracts with foreign developers to sell company assets without consent. When the news broke, stock prices plunged overnight. Reporters swarmed the gates. Inside the headquarters, silence fell. Grace found Raymond in his office, staring at the headlines. "You taught him," she whispered. Raymond nodded. "I taught him how to build. I didn't teach him how to value people." For days he refused interviews, working instead with Lisa, stabilizing employees who feared layoffs. Andrew volunteered to speak to the construction crews, reminding them that integrity outlasts panic. "We're builders," he told them. "We fix what breaks." The workers rallied, refusing to walk off the sites. Slowly, the noise outside the company began to fade. But inside, Raymond faced the hardest decision of his career: to fight for profit or stand by principle. A shareholder meeting turned into a public reckoning. Cameras flashed as Derek Stone smirked from across the table. "Business isn't charity, Ray," he said. "You can't feed ideals to investors." Raymond stood, calm but unyielding. "Then I'll feed them honesty. If integrity costs me my company, it's still cheaper than losing my soul." The room fell silent. Within a week, Derek was gone, escorted out by security, and Raymond announced a restructuring. Fewer shareholders, more transparency, employee ownership for long-term staff. The markets called it foolish. The workers called it family. That night, Ethan waited up for his father. "Mom says you're in trouble again," he said softly. Raymond chuckled. "Maybe, but this time I'm not running." Ethan nodded. "Then I won't either." They spent the next hour fixing an old model bridge Raymond had built decades ago. The glue smelled sharp, the lamp buzzed, and when the tiny structure finally stood upright again, Ethan whispered, "It's stronger where it broke." Raymond looked at him, pride warming his chest. "Exactly." Months passed. The company slowly recovered. The media shifted its story, from scandal to resilience. Raymond refused awards, directing attention to the people who stayed when everything shook. Grace's community center expanded with grants. Andrew managed construction for new housing sites, training ex-convicts and veterans. And Ethan applied for architecture school, telling his father, "I want to build places where people feel safe." Raymond laughed softly. "Then you'll build better than I ever did." One evening, as the sun melted into a golden haze, Raymond hosted a small gathering at the very first Walker Hearts building. Families cooked on grills. Children ran through sprinklers. Music played from old speakers. Lisa approached with a stack of documents. "Sir, the board approved your new foundation. You can fund education programs under your name." Raymond shook his head. "Not my name. Call it the Grace Project. She kept this family standing when I couldn't." Grace laughed through tears. "You never stop surprising me." He smiled. "You taught me that love doesn't need to be loud to change things." Later that night, alone under the porch light, Raymond looked out over the courtyard filled with laughter. For a moment, he saw flashes of the past. The man in the dusty uniform, the woman who forgave him, the sister who stayed, the young man who fell and learned to rise, the boy who found his father again. The story had turned full circle. He whispered, "Dad, the house is finally finished." Then thunder rolled far off, and a warm rain began to fall. Instead of running inside, the family stayed dancing beneath it. Raymond stepped into the rain too, the drops washing dust from his hands. Grace's voice carried over sound. "You think humanity still exists?" Raymond smiled, water running down his face. "I know it does. I see it right here." Time passed quietly. Seasons turned, buildings rose, and Raymond Walker's story became less about the man himself and more about the lives he touched. The year was closing on autumn again, the air carrying the smell of wet leaves and promise. Atlanta had changed, but so had he. Gone was the man who was behind titles. What remained was a builder who finally understood his purpose. His company was smaller now, but stronger, rooted in people, not profit. The Grace Project had opened 2 new centers, one in East Point and one in Savannah. Grace ran them with quiet discipline, teaching financial literacy and trade skills to anyone who walked through the doors. The walls were lined with photographs of workers, families, and children, faces full of second chances. Andrew now managed the main Walker Hart's housing division. He wore plain clothes, no more polished suits or gold watches. When young interns asked him how he got the job, he always smiled and said, "By losing everything I didn't deserve." He'd married a woman he met at the community center, a nurse named Denise, and together they raised a baby girl. Raymond would often visit them on Sundays, sitting on the porch swing as the child tugged at his sleeve. "Tell the story again," she'd say. And he would, about the man who wore dusty clothes so he could see the truth in others' hearts. Ethan was in his 2nd year of architecture school now, working part-time at his father's firm. He had inherited Raymond's steady eyes and Elena's quiet intelligence. One day he brought home blueprints for a new public library design. Sleek, modern, but built from sustainable local materials. "I wanted to feel like it's part of the city, not above it," he explained. Raymond smiled. "You've already learned a lesson that took me half a lifetime." Ethan grinned. "You taught it the hard way." Then came the test no one expected. Late one evening, as Raymond prepared to leave the office, Lisa came in with a worried expression. "Sir, we got an offer from Nova Developments. They want to buy out Walker Industries completely." Raymond raised an eyebrow. "Buy it?" She nodded. "All of it. They're offering triple its current value." Silence stretched. The company could be sold for hundreds of millions. But something in Raymond's chest twisted. Lisa continued. "They plan to use the land from the Walker Hart's neighborhoods for luxury condos. They'd erase the entire initiative." Raymond looked at her steadily. "Then the answer's no." Lisa hesitated. "I thought so, but they'll push hard." And they did. Nova's lawyers arrived with suits, contracts, and promises of legacy. They argued that Raymond was getting older, that his vision could live on through a larger brand. Raymond listened silently, then said, "You can't buy purpose. It's not real estate." When they threatened hostile takeover, he walked them out personally. "If you're going to take my name, you'll have to carry my heart too," he told them. "Good luck finding the blueprint for that." But the pressure grew. Nova began targeting Walker's investors, whispering fears of bankruptcy. For the first time in years, Raymond felt old ghosts returning. Fear of failure, shame, loss. One sleepless night, he went for a drive through the city. He passed by the original Walker Hart site, now glowing with lights from hundreds of families eating dinner, laughing, living under roofs he had promised them. He parked and watched a young mother carry her child up the steps. The child looked back and waved at him through the rain-streaked glass. In that moment, Raymond remembered why he had started everything. To give people dignity, not just shelter. He whispered to himself, "No deal is worth what this feels like." The next morning, he gathered his staff and family at the headquarters. The sun was breaking through the rain, light pouring in through the tall windows. Grace stood beside him, Andrew on his right, Ethan just behind. The room was full, workers, secretaries, engineers, even janitors. "I called you all here," Raymond said, "because this company isn't mine alone anymore. It belongs to everyone who believed in it. They want to buy it, to turn our homes into profit. But if we stand together, no contract can touch what we built. The crowd fell silent. Then slowly, one by one, people nodded. Grace whispered, "We'll stand with you." It became a movement. The employees collectively bought shares, turning Walker Industries into a cooperative. Something unheard of at that scale. Nova backed off, unable to touch what now legally belonged to its people. The newspapers called it a revolution in corporate ethics. Raymond called it freedom. Months later, he retired quietly. No press, no headlines. He handed leadership to Grace, Andrew, and Lisa. On his last day, he packed his few personal items into a small box. A family photo, his father's gloves, a model house. Ethan drove him home. As they pulled up to the old East Point neighborhood, Raymond smiled. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think coming back here meant failure. Now it feels like coming full circle." Ethan helped him out of the car. "You gave the city more than buildings, Dad. You gave it roots." That evening, they sat outside as the sun sank low, casting golden light over the worn porch. The air buzzed with cicadas, and a gentle wind moved through the trees. Raymond leaned back and closed his eyes, listening. Grace arrived with dinner. Andrew followed with his wife and daughter, and soon laughter filled the yard. For a while, they just talked about nothing and everything. Then Grace turned to him and asked quietly, "Do you ever miss who you used to be?" Raymond smiled. "Sometimes, but I don't envy him. He was rich and lonely. I'm broke and free." They laughed. As darkness settled, Raymond stood and walked a few steps into the yard, the stars coming out one by one. He thought of his father, of the days they worked side by side in the Georgia sun, of the times he'd failed and been forgiven, of the man he'd become because others believed he could change. He raised his face to the sky and whispered, "The house is still standing, Dad." When he turned back, his family was there, Grace holding her niece, Ethan with his arm around his mother, Andrew smiling softly in the background. Raymond's voice was calm as he said, "Maybe humanity was never gone. Maybe we just stopped looking for it." The wind rustled the trees as if agreeing. The camera of life would linger there, on that old yard filled with laughter, on the city skyline glowing faintly in the distance. A man once mistaken for a worker had rebuilt his world not with concrete or contracts, but with patience, love, and the courage to look deeper. And as the night settled over Atlanta, a single voice, steady, weathered, and peaceful, spoke the last line of the story. He wore dust so he could see the truth beneath the shine. He built towers, but in the end, the only thing that truly stood was the kindness he left behind. Humanity still exists, but only if you look deeper. Hit that like button, subscribe for more stories that matter, and let's keep the conversation going.